I'll just introduce Shaykh Ibrahim first. So, I think some of you, sorry, probably a few of us, so obviously you've been at Huntington since 2003. So I don't know your name, sorry.
Honey? Oh, sorry, I'm just... That's okay?
Yep.
Sorry.
That's okay, that's okay.
So my name is Claire.
Claire, nice to meet you. So, Shaykh Ibrahim, he's a local, well, as of a year ago, he's now a local scholar. He's the Imam of, you know, the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies? So on George Street, and now they're building a new one on Marston? Yes, Marston Road. So he's the Imam for the centre for when that's established, inshallah, and the centre on George Street at the moment. He's a graduate of Darul Uloom, which is a centre for Islamic Studies in Bury, which is a city in the north of England. So he graduated from there some years ago, I think. And he's kindly agreed to join us for the Ramadan reminders that we're having on a daily basis. So every day, inshallah, every weekday. So we won't be here on weekends, but every weekday we'll be here from 6:30 to about 6:50, inshallah, for a brief reminder and an open Q&A at the end, if that's okay.
Yeah, certainly.
So.
Thank you for that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa afdalu salati wa atammu taslim. Ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'd. So the idea of these brief reminders is just to keep us in focused on the opportunity that we have at hand, and it's not a talk or a lecture as such. So it's something just to share, and then we can have a conversation rather than as a lecture. So I think from the notes that I received, Shaykh Ibrahim yesterday pointed out why we have to fast. It's an obligation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's what is the fundamental reason behind the obligation to fast, that we are fasting because we are trying to fulfill a command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's the reason. There are benefits, there are advantages to that, some of which have been mentioned in the Quran, some of which have been mentioned in the Hadith, but the main objective is to show our servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as such, our ibadah. I was just thinking that generally, if somebody was to ask that, what were the changes that were noticeable as such in the behavior of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Ramadan, what would come to mind? And two things were, in my mind at least, they were quite apparent, and in their distinction. And the first is, of course, the Quran. You see, the Quran, the month of Ramadan, we know that fasting was prescribed for the nations that were before us also, as the Quran tells us. And obviously the days and the times that they were required to fast varied. They were not the same as Ramadan, that we have to fast in Ramadan. So it was usually, I think it's fair to say, it was aligned around a specific event that happened in their time, or was important to their tradition, religious tradition, and fasting was prescribed around that time. So what is that event in Islam? And the Quran tells us that introducing month of Ramadan, what is the month of Ramadan? Oh, it's the month of the Quran, in which the Quran was revealed. So Shahru Ramadan, what is it? Alladhi unzila fihi al-Quran, in the one in which Quran was revealed. So it's a very the fasts are a prescription in their own right, but the timing of the fast is around the revelation of the Quran, or is themed around, or it's focused on the revelation of the Quran, and the entire month becomes sacred as such. Sorry, not sacred, but becomes distinguished as such. And so we fast. So there is a very close connection between Ramadan and Quran, and there are ample hadiths which make it clear that Ramadan is a month of the Quran, and we engage with the Quran. So because we are in the early days of Ramadan, it's important to start being introspective at this early stage. So as the month goes on, we are able to then evaluate and judge how far we've progressed. So a key thing that emerges is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his engagement with the Quran, although it was he was after all the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was involved with the Quran, engaged with the Quran throughout the year, but in the month of Ramadan it increased, and visibly so, because as the hadith tells us that he would meet Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam in this month, and then they would فَيُدَارِسُهُ الْقُرْآنِ, they would study Quran with each other, so present the Quran to each other as such. And the other thing which is associated with that is that what we also find is that in the same hadith, in fact, كان أجود الناس بالخير. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the most generous of spirit, generosity of spirit, and in khair means all kinds of good. It's not restricted to a particular form of good. He was just good by nature, and he was good in giving. But in the month of Ramadan, there was a visible increase in that generosity. It was distinct, so that it could be measured, it could be noticed, and hence it was reported that وَكَانَ أَجْوَدَ مَا يَكُونُ فِي رَمَضَانِ حِينَ يَلْقَاهُ جِبْرِيلٌ فَيُدَارِسُهُ الْقُرْآنِ. So again, the connection of the Quran is coming here as well, that when he met with Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam, with increased interaction or engagement with the Quran, it also made a visible increase in the generosity of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And by generosity, it doesn't just mean giving in charity, etc. Although that's an important aspect of it, but it's not restricted to that. It just means that you are open to people. You are the compassion in you increases. You become more aware of socially aware as such, and you develop this tendency to keep whatever goodness that is there within you, not restricted anyhow, and keep it open to for others. So this is the other thing, and in fact they are connected. You see, in the Quran, we are told Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ar-Rahmanu 'allama al-Quran." The teaching of the Quran, the revelation, and then the teaching of the Quran it's an effect of Allah's rahmah, Allah's mercy. And Rahman, perhaps on another opportunity we can speak more of this. But it means the intensity of Allah's rahmah and Allah's mercy and Allah's compassion, if we can speak of such a thing. And as a result of that, we have the Quran. So our engagement, I think the bottom line that or the conclusion we can draw from this is that looking at the behavior of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the changes that Ramadan visibly brought into the personality and in the behavior of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see that an increased engagement with the Quran automatically resulted in an increased engagement with people around Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with people around him in society, at a social level. And so these two things, I think we can think of them as, I think, there is nothing wrong to see them as barometers. So towards the end of the month, how much has our engagement with the Quran, which I'm sure we are all aware, and we are all trying to do as much as we can, but how much of our engagement with the Quran results in greater love and greater feeling, greater compassion for Allah's creation, through that. So it's not just about reciting the Quran, understanding the Quran, practicing the Quran, but also the spirit of the Quran, which is, as the Quran tells us, the Rahmanu 'allama al-Quran, the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through which Quran is revealed. That rahmah should, how much of that rahmah we let ourselves or expose ourselves to, and let ourselves absorb, and then how much it reflects in our behavior with people. So these are some of the things that I thought were, inshallah, will be of benefit, so that in terms of deciding what we are trying to achieve through Ramadan. I think a good way of looking at that is to see how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and obviously these are not the only things, but these are some of the things that came to my mind first, so I thought I'll just speak about them. Any questions, Asif?
So you mentioned engaging, you mentioned reciting, understanding. I know it's difficult to prescribe that, but how do you recommend approaching that during Ramadan and then beyond?
That's an important point because what we are trying to do, because Ramadan comes once a year, and we have two duties towards Ramadan. One is to make the most of this blessed time when everything is increased minimum 70-fold, and for maximum there is no limit. So that is this need to maximize the potential of Ramadan itself. And secondly, to a long term. So this is a short term, we can say, the aspect of that. The long term aspect is to allow Ramadan to bring permanent changes within us. So these are the two things. So when we look at the Quran, and I think this is it requires longer than I think what we have 5 minutes or so to discuss. But generally, we have to. In our duty towards the Quran, recitation is one thing. So we have to try to plan our recitation around the day in such a way that we are doing both things. So we are trying to recite as much Quran as possible during Ramadan, but then we also start thinking about after Ramadan how much I want to continue to recite on a daily basis, and when I'm going to do that. So this is a sort of a training period to figure that out. At the same time, it's also important to understand the Quran. And when we say understand the Quran, the best explanation of the Quran is the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we know, was the living Quran as such. Aisha radiallahu anha described him as kana khuluquhul Quran, that his character was the Quran. So whatever Quran, the ideal of humanity, the Quran wishes to us to achieve, was personified in its most complete manner in the person of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, in terms of understanding the Quran, we can read works of tafsir, even works of seerah are a good way of understanding the Quran, and in practice. So we should fix a portion of that to exposing ourselves to the message of the Quran. At least translation. Sometimes translations can, because they can't capture the full import of a certain verse, and then you become focused on the actual text itself, even though it's usually beneficial. Sometimes it can raise questions. So tafsir is a better place to start understanding the Quran. And so for everything that we do regarding the Quran, there has to be we have to plan a short term. There has to be a short term plan, maximizing the potential of Ramadan, and then also a long term plan that how I am going to keep this consistent and continuous even after the month finishes. Yes.
You mentioned the fact that the Quran was revealed during the month of Ramadan. Could you tell us more about the revelation? Is it that this is also the ignorance on my part?
No.
It just started and finished in the month of Ramadan? Is it that every year the Prophet was rehearsing the surahs that had been revealed?
Yes. Important, in fact, a good question. So when we say the Quran was revealed in the month of Ramadan, what do we mean? Because obviously we all know that Quran was revealed over a period of 23 years, or slightly less than 23, but basically around 23 years, and depending on the need of the occasion in most cases. So how do we reconcile between the two? Now, again, the exegetes of the Quran and scholars and theologians, they have tried to explain this in a few different ways. One is that the Quran was in its entirety, from the Lawh al-Mahfuz, from the preserved tablet which is in the heavens, was revealed all at once to the Sama' al-Dunya, to the earth, to the sphere of the earth as such, and to the sky of Sama' of the Dunya, means the sky of this earth in its metaphysical understanding. It was revealed then from the Rawh al-Mahfuz. It came there all at once in the month of Ramadan.